Hi everyone, welcome to this session of the IPBES webinar series. Thank you for joining us. We are very happy to be joined today by Simon Ferrier. Simon co-chaired IPBES Methodological Assessment of Scenarios and Models together with KN Nainen, and he is here with us today to present the key findings of that assessment. Before handing over to Simon, I'd like to remind you that the recording of this webinar as well as a copy of this PowerPoint presentation will be made available on the IPBES website. On the IPBES website you can also access a range of other resources, including recordings of all previous webinars, e-learning tools, the full report and summary for policymakers for the Scenarios and Models assessment, as well as any other completed assessments. If you have any questions about the webinar series or any other aspects of IPBES work on capacity building, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on email, tsu.capacitybuilding@ipbes.net. With that, I'll hand over to you, Simon. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. We look forward to hearing your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and hello everybody. My name is Simon Ferrier, and I was one of the co-chairs of the Methodological Assessment of Scenarios and Models. This was one of the very first assessments undertaken in the IPBES 2014 to 2018 work program. And in the original decision to undertake this assessment, the rationale for doing so was stated as follows. One of the key objectives in using scenarios and models of biodiversity and ecosystem services is to move away from the current reactive mode of decision making to a proactive mode in which society anticipates change and thereby minimizes adverse impacts and capitalizes on important opportunities. The assessment had a number of purposes. These were to provide expert guidance on the use of scenarios and models to inform policy making and decision making in a variety of contexts, with particular emphasis on the role of scenarios and models in IPBES deliverables. It's very important to note that this is a methodological assessment, and therefore the focus is on methods, not on results obtained from the application of scenarios and models. The assessment had multiple target audiences. Within IPBES, these audiences included the IPBES plenary, the Bureau, and the multidisciplinary expert panel. It also included the IPBES task forces and expert groups and the expert teams undertaking regional, global, and thematic assessments. But as well as the audiences within IPBES, the assessment was also targeted at broader audiences, including of policymakers and implementers at local to global scales and practitioners employing scenarios and models for decision support. It also included the broader scientific community and funding agencies. The assessment was undertaken by an expert team which included 2 co-chairs, 15 coordinating lead authors, 51 lead authors, 12 review editors, and 21 contributing authors. This team was supported by a technical support unit hosted at PBL, the Netherlands Environmental Agency. We had 3 author meetings hosted in the Netherlands, in Argentina, and in China. We underwent 2 external review phases, which attracted 2,360 comments from 194 expert reviewers from 45 countries. The summary for policymakers, or SPM, was approved, and the full assessment report accepted at the 4th IPBES plenary in February 2016. Let's now look at the structure of the assessment report. In addition to the summary for policymakers, the report included 8 chapters. The first of these chapters provided an overview and vision on the use of scenarios and models, and this was very much intended for a more general audience. The next 4 chapters address specific aspects of scenarios and models and their application to biodiversity and ecosystem services. The first of these, chapter 2, was on using scenarios and models to inform decision-making in policy design and implementation. Chapter 3 focused on building scenarios and models of drivers of biodiversity and ecosystem change. Chapter 4 was on modelling impacts of drivers on biodiversity and ecosystems, and Chapter 5 focused on modelling consequences of change in biodiversity and ecosystems for nature's benefits to people, or what is now referred to within the IPBES community as nature's contributions to people. Then the remaining 3 chapters addressed cross-cutting issues, the first of which in Chapter 6 was the linking and harmonizing of scenarios and models across scales and domains. Chapter 7 then focused on building capacity for developing, interpreting, and using scenarios and models. And Chapter 8 took a more forward-looking perspective and focused on improving the rigor and usefulness of scenarios and models through ongoing evaluation and refinement. The rest of this webinar will be focusing largely on the material in the summary for policymakers, but for anybody who's interested in accessing further details on any of the issues covered in these chapters of the full report, I strongly encourage you to access those online. Let's now look at the structure of the summary for policymakers. This was divided into 3 main sections. The first section presented the key findings of the assessment, and there were 15 of these key findings organised under 3 high-level messages. Then the remaining 2 sections presented guidance for different audiences, and this guidance is essentially a series of suggestions about potential ways forward in improving the use of scenarios and models for assessing biodiversity and ecosystem services into the future. The first of these 2 guidance sections was aimed at the broader science and policy community and contained 6 guidance points, and that's followed by a section of guidance points targeted more at IPBES itself and its task forces and expert groups, and that consisted of another 6 guidance points. Let's now look at the key findings, and I will do this in relation to the 3 high-level messages that they are grouped under. The first of these high-level messages from our assessment was simply that scenarios and models can contribute significantly to policy support, even though several barriers have impeded their widespread use to date. And in the summary for policymakers, we go on to explain this in a little bit more detail. And essentially what we're saying is that scenarios and models can provide an effective means of addressing relationships between major components of the IPBES conceptual framework, which you see reproduced there on the right of this diagram. And so we're particularly interested there in relationships between drivers, various aspects of nature, in other words, biodiversity and ecosystem services, and then in turn relationships with nature's benefits, or as I said before, now referred to more commonly as contributions to people. So scenarios and models can help effectively bring some of these relationships to life in a way where they can then help to inform various types of assessment and policy support. So we represent that use on the left-hand side of the diagram here, and the point here is that by bringing to life those relationships in the IPBES conceptual framework, we can thereby add considerable value to the use of best available scientific, indigenous and local knowledge in assessments and decision support. Scenarios and models play complementary roles, with scenarios describing possible futures for drivers of change or policy interventions, and models essentially help to translate those scenarios into consequences for nature or nature's contributions to people. And as represented on the right-hand side, there were three main types of relationships that we focused on in our assessment in terms of the types of models that could be used to address those relationships. The first relationship of interest was that between indirect drivers, which might include socio-political, economic or technological factors, and also policy interventions, trying to address those factors, basically looking at models that would relate those indirect drivers and policy interventions to their effects on direct drivers, things like habitat degradation and climate change. And then the second relationship of interest was the impact or the potential impact of those direct drivers, for example, habitat degradation and climate change, on various aspects of nature, in other words, biodiversity and ecosystems. And the third type of relationship or model that we were interested in were models that tried to address the relationship between nature, in other words, biodiversity and ecosystems, and nature's benefits or contributions to people, including but not limited to ecosystem services. The types of models that we were interested in our assessment were very broad, in that we were looking at both quantitative and qualitative models, and on the quantitative side we were interested in both correlative models as well as process-based and expert-based models. The contributions of scenarios and models to policy and decision making are usually mediated by some form of assessment or decision support process. And this can consist of anything from very formal or quantitative decision support tools right through to much less formal and more qualitative processes. And then it's also important to note that all of this, or that the application of scenarios and models typically happens in conjunction with knowledge from a broader and often highly complex social, economic, and institutional context. Okay, Different types of scenarios can play important roles in relation to all major phases of the policy cycle, from agenda setting through policy design and implementation to policy review. And if we just look at a couple of examples of this, what's known as exploratory scenarios that examine a range of plausible futures based on potential trajectories of drivers can contribute significantly to high-level problem identification and agenda setting. On the other hand, intervention scenarios that evaluate alternative policy or decision options or management options, through either target seeking or policy screening analysis can contribute to policy design and implementation. Let's now move on to the second high-level message, and perhaps before I go any further, let me just note that, as you will have seen with the first high-level message, I'm not going to talk about every key finding underneath these high-level messages, so please consult the summary for policymakers to get a comprehensive overview of what these key findings are. I'm just selecting a few of the more important examples of those key findings. So with high-level message 2, this was saying that many relevant methods and tools are available, but they should be matched carefully with the needs of any given assessment or decision support activity and applied with care, taking into account uncertainties and unpredictability associated with model-based projections. So just to give you the flavour of a couple of the important key findings under this high-level message, one of the most important findings was essentially about the involvement of people in the scenarios and modelling process, and basically that the effective application and uptake of scenarios and models requires close involvement of policymakers, practitioners, and other relevant stakeholders throughout the entire scenario analysis and modelling process. And so this is what's known as a participatory approach, and it's now very clear from numerous examples around the world that the most effective applications of scenario analysis and modelling in policy and decision support nearly always involve different types of policymakers, practitioners, and other relevant stakeholders throughout the entire process of the application of those methods. That's a very important message from the assessment. Another important finding was that different policy and decision contexts often require application of very different types of scenarios, models, and decision support tools. So thinking back to that diagram I showed earlier of the different types of scenarios playing a role in different phases of the policy cycle, different assessment and policy activities will, in many cases, not necessarily require application of all of these types of scenarios, but will require one particular type of scenario or a subset of these types. And therefore, it's very important that the type of scenario and indeed the types of models and decision support tools employed in any particular policy or decision context match as closely as possible the particular needs of that context. And a related finding is that the spatial and temporal scales at which scenarios and models need to be applied also vary markedly between policy and decision contexts. And in the summary for policymakers, we just included two examples there to illustrate just how wide this range is in terms of spatial scales and the types of scenarios employed. So on the left there, you can see an example of a global application of scenarios and models. This was in the Global Biodiversity Outlook 4 a few years back, and so this was to help inform global agenda setting and to some extent policy design, but scenarios and models applied at a very broad global scale. But then if we move to the right-hand side, there's an example of a very different type of application of scenarios and models, in this case to local policy design and implementation within a single watershed in Thailand. And so again, it's absolutely crucial that the types of scenarios and models used and the types of data employed and the types of decision support tools are well matched to these different scales of application, and also well matched to the different phases of the policy cycle that are being focused on. Now let's move to the third high-level message, which basically just said that appropriate planning, investment and capacity building, among other efforts, could overcome significant remaining challenges in developing and applying scenarios and models. Now, I won't waste time going through any of the key findings that are presented within this high-level message, because essentially what those findings do is to set the stage for those sections that come afterwards that lay out the guidance points for science and policy and for IPBES itself. So a lot of what's under high-level message 3 is actually reflected in the subsequent guidance points. Now here I have included all of the guidance points for science and policy, or at least their main headings. There is more detail on each of these within the summary for policymakers. I won't work through all of these exhaustively, that would take too long. But as you can see beneath guidance for the broader science and policy communities, there are some of those issues that we've already covered or picked up there about, the need for scientists and policy practitioners to ensure that the types of scenarios, models and decision support tools employed are matched to the needs of the particular context involved, encouraging more widespread use of participatory approaches. There's some guidance there relating to dealing better with uncertainty, and also suggestions about improving the accessibility of well-documented data sources. So there's quite a range of guidance points there for the broader science and policy community. I wanted to, though, just focus in a little bit more detail on 2 of these guidance points, and to use this as an opportunity to also highlight some of the work that has been occurring since the release of this assessment report, and it is work that has been very much stimulated and or catalyzed by the release of this report. So the first of these points I want to highlight is number 3, about the scientific community may want to give priority to addressing gaps in methods for modelling impacts of drivers and policy interventions on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And in the summary for policymakers, there's this diagram that tries to just capture the importance of trying to better link scenarios and models across 4 key dimensions. And the first of these at the top left is about system components, linking up scenarios and models dealing with different types of drivers, different aspects of nature, of nature's benefits, and so on. And if you read the detail in the summary for policymakers, there's a particularly strong emphasis there placed on the need to find better ways of modelling the relationship between biodiversity in particular and nature's contributions to people, including ecosystem services. So that was seen as a really important gap that needs to be filled by ongoing research. But there are other dimensions there, linking multiple scenario types, in other words, linking exploratory and intervention scenarios, as mentioned earlier. A really important one is better linking scenario and modelling efforts across spatial scales, and this is because the drivers of biodiversity and ecosystem change can be very different at different scales, as can the policy needs and options of relevance across those scales. And similarly with temporal scales, the need to think of scenarios and models that address changes in biodiversity and ecosystems over both shorter term and longer term time scales. So this plea to the broader scientific community to make progress in developing better approaches for addressing these 4 dimensions has resulted in a number of initiatives from various research funding bodies, and probably the largest of these to date is the joint Belmont Forum and Biodiversa call for proposals on working on biodiversity scenarios and models. And this was very much based directly on the key findings and guidance from the IPBES Methodological Assessment, and this is referred to extensively in the original funding call. That call has now resulted in 21 international projects being recommended for funding for a total of 28 million euros, and that funding is coming from a consortium of funding agencies in over 20 different countries. So that's one example of where the IPBES Methodological Assessment has now stimulated or catalysed new research efforts in the development and application of scenarios and models of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Let's now let's stay with the guidance for science and policy and look at one more of these guidance points, which suggested that human and technical capacity for scenario development and modelling may need to be enhanced, including through the promotion of open, transparent access to scenario and modelling tools, as well as the data required for the development and testing of such tools. And if you look at the summary for policymakers and the detail underneath this guidance point, it places quite a lot of emphasis on the need for for training programs to help further develop capacity for the application of scenarios and models around the world. And again, just to give one example of where this guidance has now stimulated some action in this particular sphere. Here's an example of an upcoming training course that is being run in Brazil in July this year, and this is very much targeted at training graduate students and young early career researchers in techniques for scenario analysis and modeling. And the places in this training course, I understand there are 50 places for young graduate students and researchers from Brazil, and another 50 places reserved for young people from other countries around the world. And so again, when you look at the documentation behind this training course, it refers directly back to the IPBES Methodological Assessment. So it's very much, the course is very much tailored to actually implement the kind of training that our IPBES assessment said was needed in order to develop capacity around the world for more effective application of scenarios and models. Okay, now let's turn to the guidance for IPBES itself and its task forces and expert groups. And again, there's a whole range of suggestions laid out there. I won't talk about them all in any detail. I want to actually just focus on the first two. And the first of these was that experts planning to employ scenarios and models in platform, in other words, IPBES, thematic, regional, and global assessments may want to consider maximizing the benefit derived from analyzing and synthesizing results from existing applications of policy-relevant scenarios and models. And this was really essentially saying that given the timing of those assessments, particularly the regional assessments, but also to some extent the global assessment, there just wasn't time to develop a whole new set of scenarios tailored to the needs of IPBES, and therefore the suggestion was to try to make best possible use of existing scenarios and existing modeling approaches. But this still left the way open, particularly for the global assessment, to bring together existing scenarios and existing modeling approaches in new ways. And this is demonstrated very well by some work that has now been done over the last couple of years, coordinated by the ongoing IPBES Expert Group on scenarios and models. And this particular strand of work being coordinated by that expert group is focusing on the multi-model analysis of harmonized scenarios. And this was undertaken to directly support the IPBES Global Assessment. And so what this involved was bringing together a very large number of research groups from around the world, both people who are working or have been working on land use and climate scenarios, particularly scenarios that have already been developed within the climate science community in support of the IPCC, and bringing those groups together with groups who have been working on models of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So the whole idea of this work was to take a standard selection of global scenarios of land use and climate change, and then to analyze the potential consequences of those scenarios using a very wide range of biodiversity and ecosystem models. And so this is work that was run very quickly in order to satisfy the time constraints of the global assessments, and the outputs from these analyses have now been incorporated into the forthcoming global assessment report. The second guidance point in relation to IPBES and its task forces and expert groups was that IPBES may want to consider encouraging and working closely with the wider scientific community to develop a flexible and adaptable suite of multi-scale scenarios specifically tailored to its objectives. So this was a more forward-looking vision, where even though we were saying that for the purposes of the assessments that were underway, they would need to rely largely on existing scenarios, the assessment felt that it was still worth IPBES starting to think further ahead about developing its own set of scenarios focused particularly on the needs of the biodiversity and ecosystem service communities of practice, and doing this in a similar way to what has happened with climate scenarios under the auspices of the IPCC. And so again, the ongoing IPBES Expert Group that was established following the approval of our methodological assessment. This second guidance point has been a stimulus for another major strand of activity within that expert group, which is facilitating development of this new generation of scenarios focused very much on the ongoing and future needs of IPBES. And so this vision was laid out in this paper in Nature, Ecology and Evolution a couple of years ago, and basically what it's talking about is moving from the situation on the left there, which is very much what I described as what this group has already done to support the global assessment in terms of taking existing scenarios developed largely in the climate science community, and then essentially using models of biodiversity and ecosystem services to translate those scenarios into potential consequences for nature. But with that approach, nature itself, biodiversity and ecosystem services, don't really feature at all in the initial development of those scenarios. So that what this paper outlines is this alternative approach that the expert group is trying to move towards, which is where nature plays a central role in the development of the scenarios themselves, and hence the label that's now been given to this set of scenarios that's being developed, which are now being called nature futures. And this is a process that is still underway, and it still has another year or two to run, but it's as you can see there, it involves several steps, starting with visioning, stakeholder consultation, modelling and analysis, looping back through narratives development, but eventually producing these nature futures scenarios. And some of the work on visioning has already been done. The year before last, there was a big workshop in Auckland, New Zealand, that started off the process of visioning, what it is that people, the kinds of futures that people might want to achieve with a set of nature-focused scenarios. There's work now starting to happen on stakeholder consultation, and so this will continue to play out. But it's a very exciting time where, in the not too distant future, IPBES will be able to talk about and to work with a set of nature-focused scenarios, in other words, nature futures, in the same way that everyone's become very familiar with the set of scenarios that have been developed under the auspices of the IPCC. So that's all I was going to say in this webinar. Hopefully it has given you some idea, some value in terms of an overview of the summary for policymakers from our assessment, and of some of the work that has now been stimulated and catalysed as a result of that assessment. And again, I encourage you, if you're interested in further detail on any of the issues that have been raised, please access the summary for policymakers for that, and for even greater detail, access the chapters of the full assessment report. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that great presentation and for taking the time to join us today. Before we end the webinar, I'd just like to remind all of you listening in that you can access the recording of this webinar, as well as a range of other resources on the IPBES website. If you have any questions about the webinar series, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on tsu.capacitybuilding@ipbes.net. That's all we had for today. Thank you again for watching, and we look forward to have you join us again.